In today's reading from Nehemiah, we might be wondering what exactly is happening. Why are all the people crying and weeping as the word of the Lord is proclaimed to them? What exactly is going on in their lives that an entire assembly should react in, well, let's be honest, what seems to be an odd way? Well, we need to give a little history to what's going on. For generations, the people of Israel had been exiled from their country, from Jerusalem. They'd been in Babylon, under control of a foreign power, persecuted, not allowed to openly, truly practice their faith. And so they had not heard the word of the Lord, the book of the law proclaimed for some 70 years. In those 70 years, they had been, in a real sense, separated from the Lord. And as they were finally allowed to return to their country, to their homeland, to the holy city, the book of the law was rediscovered. It had been preserved in the city. And when it had been found, the assembly was called to hear the word of the Lord, to hear the word of the book of the law. And as they hear it proclaimed for the first time in over 70 years, they realized why it had been so. Their ancestors had ignored what it was proclaimed to them every day. Their ancestors had essentially rejected the law and chose to live their lives according to their own will, to listen to the world and to conform themselves to the world. They had essentially separated themselves from God before the exile had ever happened. But they also were most likely looking at themselves, realizing that they had done exactly the same thing. And as this law is proclaimed in their midst, they come to recognize this other fundamental truth. That it was not that God had abandoned or forsaken them. It's not that God had ever left them. It was that they had left the Lord, even though he was always with them. Because that is what the law makes very clear. That is what the word of the Lord makes so clear. That our God will never abandon or forsake us. But we can do that to him. And as I think about that, it reminds me of the story in the early church. In the 2nd century, it was illegal for Christians to gather and to worship the Lord. It was illegal for them to gather together to celebrate the Eucharist, to do what we are doing right now. And the penalty to do so was death. To do what we are doing right now in the Roman Empire would have been a death sentence. And yet, Christians gathered every Sunday. Even though they knew what would happen if they were caught. They gathered each Sunday to celebrate this great gift of the Eucharist. And we do have the story of Christians who had been captured doing just that as they were being prepared for death and asked, why? Why would you do this when you knew you would be put to death? And their response was simple. They could not live without God and without his presence in the Eucharist. To do so, essentially, paraphrasing here, was a living death. And they would rather be put to death than separated from Christ. And as we think about what it is that the people at the time of Ezra, of Nehemiah, encountered, and we think about what early Christians had to deal with, it calls us then hopefully to look at our own lives and to ask ourselves, what are we willing to do to keep our relationship with God? What is it that would cause us to separate ourselves from the Lord? Because it's never the other way. What is it that we would allow to cut us off from God? Because for the early Christians, nothing would. And the pain that it truly caused the people of Israel when they realized what they had lost for generations. But as we hear in Nehemiah, this is not a day to be saddened. It's a day of rejoicing, for we do have our God with us. We know that in the Eucharist. It's not a sign or a symbol. It is truly Jesus Christ. His body and blood, soul and divinity that are here with us today to strengthen us, to reject the ways of the world, and to embrace the ways of Christ, to strengthen us, to stay united with our God. May we truly open ourselves to this great gift. May we find where our true strength is. Yes, our lives at times can become overwhelming. They can become difficult. And we can lose our way. But as we hear Nehemiah today, we find our strength not in focusing on the world, not focusing our own lives, not trying to pull it together by ourselves, but to recognize the gift that we are given in our relationship with our God. And we find our strength in that. May the words that Ezra spoke that day come to reflect in our own lives. These are words I try to pray each day to remind me of where my true strength comes from. For rejoicing in the Lord must be your strength.